Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Rebecca. If you haven't been here before, welcome. So today we're going to be talking about episode 2 and 3 of Hulu's Only Murders in the Building. I skipped last week because I was away. I was in the Pacific Northwest, so I just wanted to chill, enjoy my vacation, and this week I am back, so I'm just gonna do the 2 episodes squished together and then kind of talk about my ideas, my thoughts, and where I think this season is gonna go. To preface, if you can hear a lot of knocking or banging in the background, that is because my neighbors are having work done on their house. I really only have a limited amount of time to be able to film these videos, so there's really nothing I can do about the fact that they're doing work on their house right now. It just is what it is. They are, allowed to do so. So bear with me. I'm sorry about the audio quality. I'll try and in post edit, make it quieter. I've closed all the windows and the doors. I'm literally sweating right now, so just know I'm doing my best. I'm trying to make it quieter, but if you can still hear it, I apologize. Before we get into this week's video, make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification, all those YouTube things. They really help me and my channel. I'm trying to hit 2,000 subscribers by the end of this year, and it really helps when you guys interact, subscribe, comment, all of those things. So yeah, send it to a friend. If you like this kind of content, then make sure to subscribe down below. I cover lots of other content as well on this channel, including books, travel, vlogs, self-love, stuff like that. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, I have a stack of books literally right here. That's for a different video. Make sure to subscribe down below and stick around. So the second episode for season 4 is called Gates of Heaven. So immediately I looked up Gates of Heaven, and this is a documentary about the animal burial industry. It's about Floyd Mac McClure, who believes that animal burials are equally as important as human ones. And this is interesting because it's mentioned a couple of times throughout the episode, kind of casually. And it's interesting that it's the literal title of today's episode, but this is a documentary film about animal burials, and then it kind of also talks about life and death, I guess. So we start with SAZZ narrating the episode, and we have another home video which is supposed to be of SAZZ and Slim Pataki, her father. So it's likely that we will be seeing a lot of home videos, some of which are actually home videos of the cast as their children, and some of them that are fake home videos of the cast. SAZZ says, "There's no point in trying not to fall. You always fall, but the trick is you get up, you dust yourself off, and you make sure you don't become dust," which is obviously ironic because SAZZ, as far as we know, has become dust. I know there are some theories that SAZZ may still be alive. I'm not gonna knock it because anything is possible. This is Only Murders. But most likely I'm thinking that she's probably dead. So we begin the episode with Charles kind of panicking because he has what he would call, I guess, SAZZ dust on his hands, and he's saying that he needs to call the police. He doesn't want to wash her ashes down the drain, so he decides to put them in a bowl and then put them in a mason jar, and then that way he can have SAZZ around. But you can tell he's really distraught because SAZZ was such a good friend of his. He cared deeply for her, and we learn a little bit more about their relationship throughout this episode. We also see that SAZZ shows up as a figment of Charles's imagination, and she says that her being dead is the least of his problems because we're assuming that this person who's killed SAZZ may have actually been after Charles instead, and therefore he is still in danger. I think that it's interesting that SAZZ is showing up as a figment of Charles's imagination because we saw this happen in season 1 with Tim Kono showing up for Mabel. Obviously he showed up a little bit more gruesomely because he was shot in the head, but he showed up and he talked to Mabel and went over what happened to him. She asked him about his life and he responded. So it's kind of a nod back to season 1, which I love because season 1 was probably my favorite season of the show thus far. And I'm hoping that this season does pull from past seasons, including season 1. So it's very cool that we have SAZZ still there, able to interact with Charles beyond just a flashback, which is kind of what we have with Bunny's season or Ben Glenroy's season. Then we go and the credits scroll, and we can see that there is a ham leg in the credits in one of the windows. They kind of zoom past it pretty quickly, but obviously if you've watched this episode, you know what that means. Oliver and Mabel are trying to figure out where the shot came from. You know, they are pretty sure that it was on the 14th floor in the west wing of the Arconia, but they don't know which apartment it came from, so they're kind of like spacing it out. And they notice that there are shards of glass on the inside of the windowsill in Charles's apartment, so they're pretty sure that the shot did come from outside and came into his apartment. I guess the concern here would be that maybe someone shot SAZZ in Charles's apartment, but in that case there would be no shards of glass on the windowsill. It would have been a possibility, but they've cleared that up. It definitely came from, you know, across the way. And we also know that someone did have access to Charles's apartment, but in this situation, I feel like this doesn't really help us that much because, yeah, you could say, oh, like it's one of the residents of the Arconia, but the trio did openly talk about the fact that there are secret passageways hidden throughout the Arconia in the past seasons of their podcast. So really at this point, anyone could figure that out. And as we see, Jan does make a reappearance in this episode using these secret passageways. So if she can use them, anyone can use them. And I think that's part of the reason why they brought her in, was to represent that, like, this clue doesn't hold a lot of weight for us. Anyone could really have gotten into Charles's apartment. So the trio decide that they're going to use luminol on the floor, which apparently highlights like blood and bodily fluids, in order to be able to figure out exactly where SAZZ was laying on the floor when she died. And they do mention that Jan might be a suspect because SAZZ said that she needed to break up with her, and Charles also tried to break up with Jan and she tried to kill him, and Tim Kono also broke up with Jan and she killed him. So we know that this is kind of like a theme for Jan. There are even more parallels to the season 1 Tim Kono case, with Jan coming back and her possibly being a suspect. We learned that the Westies, or the people who live in the West Arconia, are renters, whereas the people who live in the East Arconia are owners. So that's something that kind of like sets them apart. And then we learn a little bit about who exactly is living across from Charles on the 14th floor. So we've got Stink Eye Joe, who Charles has characterized as hostile because of the way he looks through the window. We've got the Sauce family, who is always making sauce. And we've got Christmas all the time guy, who works out and has Christmas in his apartment all the time. And then we have the closed blinds apartment, where the lights go on, but he's never actually seen who lives in that space. We also learned that the west tower of the Arconia was sealed off from the rest of the Arconia after someone created a brothel in one of the apartments. So technically, we don't know that there aren't secret passageways that connect between the west and the east. It's still definitely a possibility. I don't necessarily know what sealed off means. Maybe the implication here is if it is sealed off, then someone in the West Wing wouldn't have been able to use the secret passageways to get into Charles's apartment, but we don't know that for sure. It just seems like the Westies don't have like direct access into the rest of the Arconia. And it kind of seems like there's like a power play here, like a class dynamic, like they're looked down upon because they're renters and not owners. There's a little bit of beef between the two sides. Like the Westies think that the Easties are like snobby and pretentious and think like very highly of themselves. So the trio asks that so Mabel and Oliver ask that Charles stays home because he's still technically a possible target, and he kind of fights it, but they tell him to Postmates the luminol to his apartment and create the murder board. And as Oliver and Mabel are leaving Charles's apartment to go to the west wing of the Arconia, we learn that there is another Arconia-wide meeting to stop the podcast movie from happening because they feel it will overrun the Arconia with like cameras and producers. There's people who are against it in the building because they don't want that kind of publicity brought to their home. Then we have Oliver mention that he is worried about his relationship with Loretta, and he says that that one of her co-stars has a real John Hamm in the pants. This is probably the first time in this episode that ham is mentioned, but it is mentioned quite a few times between ham, pigs, and like some other things. So that I feel like is a clue here. We're trying to figure out like, what does this mean? All this mention of ham and pigs, etc. So Oliver and Mabel are on their way to the West Tower. Charles is watching some sort of SAZZ documentary because he misses her, and she now talks about the gates of heaven and pet cemeteries, and this is, the name of the episode, and she says it was about pet cemeteries but with some deep existential shit about the afterlife. So once again, gates of heaven are mentioned, and I just think it's important to point out. SAZZ says that Charles doesn't have to feel bad about her dying because her job was to take hits for her guy, and obviously he is her guy. So we see even more they had this close relationship with each other, and I don't know, they just really cared about each other. And then Charles goes on to say that he feels bad that the only way she's going to be remembered is through this documentary that she, is speaking in, because she was never the face of, she was the stunt woman. She was the behind the scenes person. So, people saw Charles's face when she was, doing his stunts in Brazos. So he's feeling bad that he's going to be remembered for Brazos when she did all the most difficult parts of being Brazos, all the dangerous stuff. And SAZZ says that being on screen isn't the only way to be remembered. This also might suggest that there's some sort of like dynamic and power play in terms of like who the bad guy actually is. Like maybe the person who actually did the hit job isn't actually the one running the ropes and pulling all the strings. Maybe there is some sort of puppet master here that we are, eventually going to find out about. If you are on the Reddit page for this show, a lot of people speak about and also hope that there is going to be some sort of Moriarty character. If you don't know what Moriarty is, he is the bad guy in Sherlock Holmes, and in Sherlock Holmes, a lot of the cases are connected because Moriarty is the bad guy that is pulling the strings in these cases, and so there's like these interwoven and interconnected invisible strings, Taylor Swift reference, but they're all actually connected even though they don't seem like they are. And so I think a lot of people are hoping that season 5 of Only Murders, which I believe is set to be the last season, but I'm not positive, is going to connect all of the murders in the building, which would make sense because it's quite a coincidence to have so many people murdered in one building. Just saying. Moving on from that, Jan obviously shows up covered in blood, and she's wearing like a staff badge and a uniform, and immediately Charles is like, oh my god, what the heck, and it cuts scene. And then we cut over to Mabel and Oliver, who are at 14E, and they find out that Stink Eye Joe is really named Vince Fish. He actually has pink eye in this situation, and we learned that all the windows in his apartment are painted shut, so they can't actually be pulled open. So they're like, okay, it must not have happened in his apartment because they're all painted shut and they're sealed permanently. So then we kind of zoom back to Charles and Jan, and we learn that Jan has used these secret tunnels to get into Charles's apartment, which is what I was referencing earlier with like, maybe it could really be anyone, because if Jan can escape jail and get into the Arconia via the secret tunnels, then anyone who's listened to the podcast can get into the Arconia via the secret tunnels. So it really doesn't narrow down our pool of possible killers. So Jan goes on to explain that she broke out because she was worried about SAZZ, that SAZZ called last week and sounded upset, and we kind of watched Jan and Charles reminisce a little bit. He's obviously afraid because she's a murderer, but also like they did have this full relationship, and she's the only other person who knew SAZZ, you know, on a deeper level. They were in a relationship. So then we zoom back to Oliver and Mabel, and we learn that the door in between Vince's place and Inez's place, the SAZZ family, has a number code, and immediately we're like, okay, this must be the post-it note on SAZZ's desk, and lo and behold, later on we figure out it is the post-it note on SAZZ's desk. So Inez is the mother of the SAZZ apartment with her husband Alfonso and her daughter, who I believe's name is Mira, but I'm not 100% sure. And we learn that Inez is in love with Brazos. She's, you know, has this huge crush on Charles. And, you know, her husband doesn't love this because she keeps saying that she has a hall pass for Charles. And he's like, hall passes are supposed to be for people who you probably will never meet, not someone who you live across the way from. So this is funny. And all of this is just to continue, obviously, putting suspicion on different people. So now we're like, oh, maybe Alfonso did it because he doesn't like that his wife has this big crush on Brazos. They all come in together and they play this game called Oh Hell. I did look it up. It's a card game where they talk about tricks, and I guess like you have to guess each round how many tricks you're going to make, and then you like put your cards down, and whoever has the highest suit that matches the suit that the first card is turned over. If you know how to play, go ahead and comment it down below if you feel it, you know, relates to the rest of the episode. I did look it up and I didn't see anything like super relatable, but I thought it was interesting that they used the term tricks when playing the game. You know, they go on to talk about a knife in the bathroom, and, you know, the daughter says, I need a pick-me-up. And, you know, we're going back and forth and we're like, okay, what the heck is in these people's bathrooms? This is, you know, scary. We flash back to Jan and I almost said Brazos and Charles, and she says she really loved SAZZ, and her and Charles continue to talk about, you know, their relationships with SAZZ. Apparently Jan's shirt is covered in prison guard brain. Gross. And finally, we switch back to Mabel and Oliver again. It's a lot of like this scene here, this scene there, kind of going back and forth. And we learn that there is a leg of ham, hanging in the shower, which is apparently imported from Portugal. We also learn that Dudenoff lives in the place with the lockbox next door, and the daughter is telling the trio that that's who lives there, and her mother kicks her under the table. So it really seems like all of the neighbors are covering for Dudenoff. They say he's out of town. They don't really want to talk about him. We learn from Jan that SAZZ thought that someone had eyes on Charles, and so she was poking around to try and figure out who it was. And Jan goes on to say that you only get rid of the body because you killed the wrong person and you don't want the right one to be alert. So once again, we're being told that it's very possible that Charles was actually the target in all of this, and that SAZZ took her last hit for him, protecting him. Jan says that she's going to have to run away and disappear because the cops are going to pin this on her, and she leaves the way she came and gives him a little woof as she goes, which used to be like their thing. And I'm kind of sad to see her go because I love Jan. Like, I just love her as a character. She was such a fun villain, and I loved her in the first season, so I'm kind of sad she can't stick around, but I get that like that's not her character arc here. Mabel and Oliver arrive just as soon as Jan leaves, and then of course, you know, Mabel and Oliver are pretty concerned that Charles is actually losing it, so they go back to the west wing of the Arconia to try and break into the Dudenoff place. The numbers that SAZZ had on her desk in her post-it note worked, and this apartment is pretty bare bones. It's kind of dirty. There's a ham radio. There's, you know, a very basic bed. There's just, it doesn't look like it doesn't look like a lived-in space. It looks like a crash pad that maybe someone uses while they're like on their way through town. So it's not like homey like any of the other apartments we've seen. I also wanted to mention, obviously the ham radio is the second time we've heard the word ham, or no, the third time? I don't know. We've heard ham a lot in this episode, and I just wanted to explain that a ham radio, so this is what the definition is. The word ham, as applied to 1908, was the station call of the first amateur wireless station operated by some amateurs of the Harvard Radio Club. They were Albert S. Hyman, Bob Almy, and Poogie Murray. At first, they called their station Hyman Almy Murray, but eventually there was some confusion with different stations throughout the country, and they ended up shortening it to HAM, H-A-M, for the first letter of each of their names. So that is why it's called a ham radio, and obviously the radio continues to gain importance by the end of this episode. So we also see that there is a footprint on the radiator, and the window has been pried open, so there's like little sprinkles of paint from the window pane being opened. So we do know that this window has been opened, and it's pretty evident that whoever took the shot at Charles, or maybe they knew it was SAZZ, took it from this apartment. They also find what they think is tinsel on the floor of the apartment, which is obviously a nod to Christmas Guy, and they're thinking, hey, maybe he is the killer. And they find a pig in the bathtub, and someone bangs on the door. Mabel opens it, and the pig escapes, but there is no one to be seen outside of the door. Just a quick nod to pig symbolism, because I did look it up. Pigs have basically two sides to what the meaning, representation, symbolism of a pig is. So on the one end, there's greed and gluttony, dirty, etc. And then on the other end, a lot of cultures actually believe that pigs represent luck and prosperity. So you've got these like two very different viewpoints of what a pig symbolizes. Is the meaning of this pig like someone is very greedy and like is trying to like gain property and etc., or is this meaning like luck, like it was lucky that they found the pig, it was lucky that they found the ham radio? We don't really know yet. It's not super clear. Like I said, the pig escapes. We go back to Charles's apartment. The luminol has been delivered, but he's afraid to go downstairs because he doesn't want to die. And when he's opening the door, the police barrel in and say that Jan has escaped prison and that she had like a bunch of pictures of herself doing weird things to Charles. I'm just assuming like murdering him. So the police came right over. Detective D is back. We love her. She's my fave, Detective D. The trio tells her that there was in fact a murder, and the cops go to the basement to check out the incinerator. Charles needs a minute because he's just very overwhelmed by all this, and he talks to SAZZ about how they met. And this is kind of where the episode gets a little bit deeper, because we see that SAZZ actually made Charles friends on Brazos, like for him. So SAZZ invited a bunch of people over to Charles's trailer. He always used to eat lunch alone. And SAZZ showed up one day with a bunch of different guys who worked on set and was like, hey, like, Charles invited us to a poker game. Now, obviously, Charles did not invite anyone to a poker game because he didn't speak to any of these people. And all these people were like, oh, Charles, that's so nice of you. Like, thanks for inviting us over. And he had this poker game for like years after this happened. So it's just so meaningful that SAZZ, even as his stunt woman, was always looking out for him, always had his back. She saw that he was lonely, she saw that he ate alone, so she made friends for him. Like, I don't know, that's so touching to me. Like, it makes me like teary-eyed. Like, that's incredibly sweet. Like, she's his best friend. They end up spraying the luminol on the floor, and we see the message. So the message says tap in. We now realize through the episode we learned that tap in is when like Charles was right about to do the, they're going into a dangerous scene where they needed a stunt woman. Charles pauses, he stops where he is, SAZZ says tap in, she switches places with him, and then she does whatever like hard, scary things the stunt woman has to do before Charles steps back in as Brazos. And so it's interesting because it seems like it's a message that only Charles would understand, And it's a message that implies probably that it's now Charles's turn to tap in. Like, it's his time to do the dangerous things. She can't protect him anymore because she knew she was dying. And so she wrote tap in. And so it's moving that, like, even in her last moment, she was trying to protect him. She was like, this isn't just an ordinary murder. Like, you need to tap in. Someone's coming for you. Which continues to imply that Charles was actually the target. We also learned that the note with the numbers on it that let them into the Dudenoff apartment actually says, oh hell. This is something that I mentioned in my last video. If you like turned the note upside down, that's what it looked like. And we know that Oh Hell is the game that the Westies play across the way on the 14th floor. So once again, tying in Oh Hell, what does this mean for us? We do not know. And last but not least, Charles looks, he looks at the camera and he says, we aren't investigating SAZZ's murder anymore. We're investigating mine. So we have a lot of clues here. None of them are super specific as to who the murderer actually is, but we do think that it probably has something to do with the Westies, the Oh Hell group. We do think that it has something to do with Charles being the murder target and someone not liking him. There's a possibility that maybe there's some sort of, puppeteer in the background pulling the strings. But of course, let's go into episode 3, Two for the Road. So firstly, this is another movie name. Two for the Road is a movie starring Audrey Hepburn and Albert Finney. And basically it's about this couple and it goes through different periods of their life. They've become very unhappy in their marriage. It's been kind of monotonous, and they kind of go back through different periods of their life and like trips that they've taken together, and then they both cheat on each other, and in the end they decide to stay together because they decide they truly love each other, even though they have a hard time in their marriage sometimes. And so that's kind of the gist of the movie. I didn't see anything like massively that stood out as a clue to me, other than the fact that maybe in this situation we're actually dealing with a couple. Last season we dealt with a mother and a son. The season before it was, Poppy, and the season before that it was Jan. It was a jilted lover, but this season maybe it is two people and it's actually a couple. That would also make sense for why they were able to drag SAZZ's body out of Charles's apartment. Maybe one was the shooter on one side and one was the collector of the body on the other side. We don't know, but just wanted to mention the storyline of the movie. In the preview, we see that SAZZ, this is taken from season 3, SAZZ is talking about the fact that Ben Glenroy died and how she thought that maybe that person was after Charles, not Ben. Now, obviously, we know this isn't true because we know the storyline of season 3, but we did have that episode where Charles almost died multiple times. He almost got squashed by something falling from like the theater ceiling. He got stuck in that room and almost like suffocated because of the smoke. So SAZZ might have a point here, and it would be really cool for this to be true because I've always wanted the seasons to be more interconnected, going from one to the other and like having, like a continuous interlocking of like what's going on. Sometimes the seasons feel very stark. It's like this season this happens, and then like the last episode we figure out like that there's been a new murder or whatever. We move on to the next season and we like forget all of the clues and the characters and the important parts of last season, and we're just expected to move on. And for me, I've always wanted the seasons to be more connected, basically. SAZZ says that she thought that maybe Charles was the target and not Ben Glenroy. She also says she has a ham radio and that there was chatter that they wanted Charles gone. We see that the Dudenoff apartment also has a ham radio. So there's like this question of last season people were saying that they wanted Charles gone. Who are these people? Why do they want him gone? What is the significance of like him living in the Arconia? Like who would murder him, really? This also leaves the question. SAZZ says she has a ham radio. I don't think it's something that's like massively popular for a lot of people to have. Is the Dudenoff apartment SAZZ's? Did she go undercover as Dudenhoff to like get closer to people in the Arconia and try and figure out who was going after Charles? Like, we don't actually know who Dudenhoff is. So there is this, and this apartment is like so unlived in, and we know SAZZ like has her own place in LA. So is it possible that this apartment is actually SAZZ's that she just keeps for when she stops by New York? So we have a screenshot of the murder board, which doesn't have anything insane on it. Like, they have all of the more recent suspects. I'm sure that with more episodes to come, it'll become more helpful with like more clues being tagged on. Right now, I think that like anyone who they've mentioned so far is like very obvious, you know, for them to say that it's anyone from the 14th floor of the West Wing seems kind of unlikely. So I'll be interested to see how they continue on with this. You never believe the first person they accuse. It's never the first one. We also have someone narrating. I'm not 100% sure who it is, but I think it's Zach Galifianakis. Then we go on and we see that the police are in the apartment. They found the joint replacements for SAZZ's body in the incinerator. They found a shell for the gun, and Dee is giving the trio information because the feds are apparently coming in and kicking her off the case. So she talks about that the feds are assuming that Jan hired someone to do the job. The shooter was very good, a single 300 Win Mag casing. M. Dudenhoff is apparently a retired professor, but he's not in town, and they actually say he's in Portugal, which is interesting because we know that last episode the ham hanging in the bathroom was supposedly from Portugal, a Portuguese ham. So we're thinking, you know, what's the importance of Portugal here? What's going on? We're told that Rudy, the Christmas guy, heard the shot, but no one else heard it. And SAZZ's phone has been turned off. Also, Charles mentions that he's tapping in. He feels a lot of guilt for the fact that SAZZ has died, especially when it was supposed to be him. And so he wants to bring her murderer to justice. And then, of course, the opening credits happen, and we see that the actors' chairs are on the roof in the opening credits. So that is the little tidbit because the actors are showing up today. So the Hollywood A-listers have arrived to shadow the trio, to get to know them better, and pretty quickly Eva Longoria comes in and mentions that she was in Boss Baby 2. So I did go out of my way to look up this movie, and it's a children's movie, but apparently the gist of it is actually about the reuniting of two brothers who have become estranged. I'm not going to bore you with the whole summary of the movie. It's a kid's movie. It's about babies who are actually like spies, I think. But in the end, the whole premise of the movie was that they wanted to reunite these brothers, and there have been discussions of brothers in this season with the brothers, sisters, and we know that familial ties actually make a lot of headway in this show. You've got the mother and son trope of last season. You've got the brothers trope of, you know, Will and Theo actually ending up being brothers. So there's a lot of like underlying secrets and family ties in the show in general. So it wouldn't be surprising if the show this season has something to do with the reuniting of two brothers. Will it be Will and Theo? Will it be new brothers? Will it be two brothers who don't know that they're related? That is the question. The actors are very excited to solve this murder. Detective Dee also mentions that she thinks that Zach Gallifragilistic is absolutely delicious. And she says that if anything happens to him, she will personally kill Oliver. We also have a Jeffrey Dahmer mentioned by Oliver. So Oliver's talking about the fact that you only ever get like one biopic in your life, possibly two if you're really special, like Jeffrey Dahmer. And just wanted to pull in because I feel like everything mentioned in the show is significant. Jeffrey Dahmer is a serial killer who used to eat his victims and also preserve their bodies. So and so that begs the question, are we going to have multiple kills this season? Because we're talking about a serial killer here. Is this alluding to the fact that maybe we already do have a serial killer, if, you know, if the murders from other seasons are connected. Is that what this is implying? Serial killer, question mark. We also learned that Eugene is pretty obsessed with Charles, and the trio ends up deciding the actors can stay and shadow them for the day, even though it kind of interrupts their plans. They believe that the killer is a hunter because of the type of bullet casing that they found, and like, I guess it would have been like a long-range rifle, like the one that they would have used to hunt deer. So now we're kind of diving into who from the 14th floor, the west wing of the Arconia, could possibly be the murderer. So they go over and say that Vince Fish isn't strong enough to carry a body like that, but that his eye patch might be from gun kickback. They decide that Rudy is strong enough because he does all that working out. And then we kind of question, you know, what if all of the Westies, the 14th floor Westies, did it together? You know, everyone seems like they have one thing that they are good at and one thing that they're not. So maybe they they put their heads together and they tried to murder Charles. Who knows? Unlikely, but, you know, it's just something to keep an eye on. We also learned that Charles got the building to ban real Christmas trees because they're a fire hazard, so this is another reason why Rudy maybe would have wanted to murder Charles, since he's so obsessed with Christmas. And immediately, my first thought is that, and we do figure this out in this episode, but my first thought is that this tinsel is actually something else. And part of the reason I immediately thought this, other than the fact that it feels a little bit too obvious, is that in other seasons, like in season 1, another season 1 parallel, we found Jan's bassoon cleaner in Tim Kono's stuff, and we were like, is this a cat toy, like a sex toy? So it's not immediately evident what it is until later on when it is like exposed. And so I think it is pretty obvious that this is not tinsel, but I think it's also interesting because what could it possibly be? And I think it'll bring us closer to who the killer is if we can figure out what this non-flammable piece of like what looks to be like metallic string is. And once again, like I said, it kind of feels like we're going back to our roots from season 1, and I love that. So just a quick vibe check of the actors. It seems like Eugene Levy is totally sucking up to Charles. He's like kind of obsessed with him. And Eva Longoria's Mabel is an alcoholic because she's drinking at like 10 a.m. And Zach, Gallifragilistic, hates Oliver. And yes, I will be calling him that from now on. So because Mabel wants to go and check to see if Rudy, Christmas all the time guy, has any tinsel that matches what she found, she decides that she's going to go to the west end of the Arconia. We have Oliver, who has decided he needs to make Zach like him because he really wants this movie to happen and he wants to be portrayed well. He brings Zach to his apartment to basically like Oliver-fy him, dress him, floof his hair, take him shopping, etc. And Howard shows up with the pig to basically check in, and he's clearly jealous that he was not cast as Oliver in the movie. I think it's also interesting that Howard has now become this like pet collector. He's got this pig, he's got a dog, he's got a cat, when he only used to be a cat guy. Like, could this be in reference to the like pet cemetery situation, since he had a cat that was frozen in his refrigerator and now he has Gravy, the like grave digging dog? It's just interesting that we had that like pet cemetery reference, and then we have Howard, who has basically collecting different kinds of animals like Pokemon. So Oliver asks Howard to monitor the ham radio because he's got better things to do. And they also have this mention of Mrs. Levitt, where basically Oliver's testing Zach's Oliver knowledge and asks him who's like the real Mrs. Levitt, Lansbury or Lapone. And I believe Zach's is Lansbury, and Oliver and Howard are both like, it's obviously Lapone, you're a moron. But I wanted to point this out because this is a tie back to Sweeney Todd. It was, I think, on Broadway, but it was some sort of theater production, and Angela Lansbury played Mrs. Levitt in the play. And Mrs. Levitt is Sweeney Todd's love interest. She basically helps him murder the people, and then she bakes them into pies and she like sells them to people, which is obviously heinous. And so then you've got Patti LuPone, who came back in the revival of the play as Mrs. Levitt later on, I think in the early 2000s. And so it's just bringing up this character, another relationship, another murder relationship between, you know, this, you know, psycho killer and this romantic interest who is supportive of the killer's desires to kill people, but then is also like helping him hide the bodies. So once again, we've got like, is this a two-person job, and are these people in a relationship? That seems kind of likely at this point. So we learn that Christmas Guy is 14H, and Mabel has gone over to talk to him. Eva Longoria is already there. Then we've got Eugene and Charles, who go over to Vince Fish's place to basically try and get him to remove his eye patch, because they think that it's possible that the kickback of the gun knocked him in the eye, when in reality, we do obviously learn that it really is a really bad case of pink eye. We continue on, and Christmas Guy does seem to be the hunter type. He's got like the head of a deer on his wall, and he's got like deer wallpaper, and he says that he's got ground deer hoof in his eggnog. And so, you know, more and more it's like, oh, it's pointing to Rudy, it must be him. We also learn that Rudy has his own ham radio. Why do all of these people have ham radios? And the Perfect Strangers theme song plays on it, and he quickly turns it off and puts it away. Then we move to Oliver and Zach. Oliver is telling Zach that he's always wanted to be in a film, and also that he wants it to be his best movie. Zach goes on to ask the question that we've all been wondering this whole time, which is, are Oliver's stories all true? And Oliver says that the key to a good story is that he wants them to be true. So this is probably the first time we've ever heard Oliver admit that like his funny like side stories are not actually real. And of course, like, we've probably assumed this because he's always talking about like meeting obscure famous people in like weird environments and doing like crazy drugs or whatever. But it's interesting to hear him say like the best Oliver stories are the ones that you want to be true. And we have Oliver and Zach's montage moment where they're like dancing and skipping, and of course the song that is playing is the Perfect Strangers theme song. That is what they're dancing to. Then we move on, and we've got Eva Longoria, who's trying to trigger Rudy into confessing that he's the murderer. So she literally takes a gun off the wall and shoots him. It turns out that the gun is fake, but she didn't know that. And he ends up revealing that he actually hates Christmas, that he did one social media post with him lifting that was Christmas themed, and now like all of his content has to be Christmas themed in order to get any traction or likes. So now we know that like the motive that Rudy had for wanting to kill Charles because he banned real Christmas trees is not really a motive that works here. He also tells Mabel that the tinsel isn't tinsel because it's not flammable, and tinsel is Christmas's silent killer. You know, he tries to light it on fire. It does not light, and he says, yeah, that's not tinsel. So we know that this tinsel, it's something else. Something else. We have more Perfect Stranger mentions, and we go back to Zach and Oliver. Zach is on the phone saying super mean things about Oliver, talking about how he's a one-dimensional narcissist. I don't know, Zach's just been heinous this entire time. We hate Zach Gallifragilistic. Howard goes on to defend Oliver and says that he never quits, and that even though Howard believes that Loretta and Oliver are going to break up, Oliver never gives up and, you know, is clearly still giving it his all. So he really like defends him, but then makes it like a really backhanded compliment. And then Zach decides that Oliver is actually what he describes as a Technicolor cockroach that refuses to die, and he says he will immortalize the real, tragic, heartbreaking, and lonely Oliver Putnam, which is obviously terrifying for Oliver because he wants to be immortalized as this creative king who created like these crazy shows and has this successful podcast. Like, he wants to be immortalized as a success, and Zach has now threatened to immortalize him as a tragedy. So we come to kind of the end of the episode. We notice that there is a photo of all of the people from the 14th floor of the West Wing of the Arconia, the Westies, and they're all hanging out. It's on Vince's desk, and it has a face scratched out. So together, right now, live on camera, just kidding, we're going to look into this. So this person is tall, taller than the Rudy the fitness guy, slightly shorter than Vince Fish, and taller than both of the women in the SAZZ family. They are holding a pig, and wearing this like overalls and kooky outfit. Now I think the question is, at the end of the day, the question is, who is this person? Could this be SAZZ? I think that it could be SAZZ, that it very much could be SAZZ. This person seems to be white. They seem to be relatively tall and thin. Is it possible that SAZZ was impersonating someone called Dudenoff in order to get closer to the Westies and try and figure out who's after Charles? I think that's pretty likely. Could it be someone else? Yeah, it could be anyone. But at this particular moment, with the pixely photo I have, it's pretty hard to zoom in and tell who it actually is. Looks like the face has been covered with Sharpie, and the person is wearing a hat, a striped sweater, what looks to be a tie, so I feel like the assumption would be that this person is a man, or they could be non-binary. I'm not going to claim. But SAZZ often would wear, a tie and a suit, so could this be SAZZ? I think it definitely could be. We then learn that Mabel decides to go back to the secret apartment. She uses the code, and she decides she's going to squat in this apartment because after 30 days, apparently it will be hers. She needs a place to live anyway. She's been crashing at Oliver's, and she's been wanting to find an apartment and live at the Arconia for ages. She says that basically Dudenoff will have to come kick her out, which will force him to show up since she doesn't think he's in Portugal. So the ham radio comes on and someone says that says meet me at 445. They realize quickly that it is a ham radio frequency. They go on. What sounds like a woman answers, and she says the last person to come on and ask these questions, the questions being who is Dudenoff and who is after Charles, got killed. And she says, drop this or you'll be next. And then the pig, squawks. The pig oinks. And she says, I miss you, Hammy Faye Baker, which is a reference to Tammy Faye Baker Messner, who apparently was on some sort of like evangelical TV. I did look into her. I didn't see anything crazy. She was married to this guy who did like terrible things to people. He ended up going to jail and they got divorced. So once again, another kind of like crazy relationship moment. So just another clue to add to the clues that we already have. Okay, now let's go over the theories that I have. So my biggest theory for this season is truly that it's going to be a two-person, that two people are going to be the killer, and that they are going to be in a relationship. Not a familial relationship, but actually a romantic husband and wife or like partners relationship. We've got a lot of clues that allude to marriage, relationships, like the fact that this episode is called Two for the Road, the fact that they reference Mrs. Levitt, who is the romantic partner for Sweeney Todd. I feel like we've gotten a lot of that kind of like relationship-ness, and we've never had a romantic duo. You may argue that Poppy and that guy who was a police officer were a romantic duo, but I would argue that Poppy really did all the legwork on her own and he just helped out a little bit. But I think that this situation, these killers are going to be in a relationship working together. Whether they will be openly in a relationship or whether they will be secretly in a relationship, I don't know yet. But that's my best theory going on episode 3. I would also say that I don't think it's any of the people from the 14th floor from the West Wing, just because we've kind of explored them quite a bit in the last episode, since it was solely focused on them and figuring out their motives. I feel like it's too obvious. I'm not going to discount the actors because I think, you know, they are definitely suspects. I'm not going to discount the other residents at the Arconia because I think that's still a possibility. I'm not going to discount anyone on the production team. So I feel like the murder board really doesn't have a lot to say right now, and that's partially because of how early in the season we are. But I will say that I do think that the murder this season is going to have to do with property and like the Arconia itself, and wanting to either make changes or own certain apartments or parts of the Arconia in order to make those changes, possibly eliminating people who would be against said changes. Like I said in the first video for episode 1 of this season, I do think that this may tie back to season 2 when we had that photo of the Arconia with this like big like structure on top of it, and people wanting to make changes to the Arconia itself. A lot of people would probably be against that in the building because it is such like a historic icon, but I do think it's very likely that this has to do with more than just the simple basic dislike of Charles as a human being. It must tie into his history with the show Brazos, since SAZZ was also on that, or it'll just have to do with the Arconia itself and someone wanting to own property or make changes to, especially since the first movie referenced was Once Upon a Time in the West, and that was a huge theme for the movie itself. If you want me to dive a little deeper into that theory, definitely go back to the first video that I posted a couple weeks ago. I will link it up above so you can check it out. But yeah, those are my theories thus far. I know it's not super fleshed out because we're 3 episodes in, but ideally I would love to see the seasons connect. I do think that there is a Moriarty character. I would love to dive deeper by watching, you know, all 4 seasons and then coming up with who I think that character is. A lot of people have said Howard. Also, I just figured out that Cookie is Charles's ex-girlfriend that left him for SAZZ, and then he had to spend like 3 seasons still working with the two of them. So that's who Cookie is. That's who's on the murder board. Maybe she'll come out and like be in one of the episodes in the future, but call back to who Cookie is. Charles's ex-girlfriend that left him for SAZZ. So those are my theories for this season thus far. So far, I'm really enjoying this season. I think that it seems like the clues are a little bit more cohesive, and that maybe it does have to do with past seasons, which is what I've wanted from the past 2 seasons, to like really tie things together. So I'm excited to see if that happens. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notification, all that good YouTube stuff. And thank you so much for watching. I love you guys so much, and I am back to my weekly schedule. So I will see you guys next week with another Hulu's Only Murders in the Building video. I love you. Bye.